If everybody could we could come in. There's seats, as usual, towards the front. Come on in. My name is Rusty Reno, and I'm the editor of First Things magazine. And I'd like to thank the Heritage Foundation for allowing us to have our annual First Things Washington, D.C. lecture here at this venue. In the last couple of years, Heritage has also hosted us, and we've had our event on the sixth floor, and I'm only grateful that with this renovation that this nice space is now available for us. Before I introduce the speaker, my staff always urges me to engage in a proper promotion of First Things magazine. And, you know, I'm looking out over this group of people that seem so intelligent and faithful and engaged, and it strikes me as probably unnecessary to urge people to subscribe to First Things because, I mean, surely everybody in this room is already a subscriber. But if for some reason you've let your subscription lapse, or if you want to take out a subscription for 10 or 20 of your close friends, you can go online, firstthings.com, and subscribe to First Things magazine. It's easy, and all the cool kids are doing it. So please subscribe to First Things. Carl Trueman, our lecturer tonight, is a person who I think brings two important qualities to commentary on contemporary public life. The first is a deep immersion in the Word of God. And the scriptures not only provide us with saving truths, they also provide us with wisdom about human affairs. And his deep grounding in the Word of God, I think, has made Carl a reliable theological commentator on the affairs of our time. And the second is that Carl Trueman is a trained historian. He got his PhD in Reformation history from Cambridge University, and he is a man who understands that our ideals, our hopes, and our aspirations are always worked out in the concrete flow of human affairs, and that we have to approach the issues of our time, the contested ideas of our time, with a rich sense of the historical reality of the human condition. And I think these are qualities that make Carl Trueman one of the most trusted, certainly in the stable of First Things writers, one of the most trusted theological voices in our magazine and on our website. And so it's really with great pleasure that I introduce him today to deliver this annual Washington, D.C. lecture, The Hour for a New Humanism. So please join me in welcoming Carl Trueman.
Well, it is a great pleasure to be here this evening to give this lecture. I want to thank Rusty for inviting me to do so, and also to thank all of you for coming along. It always amazes me that anyone will ever show up to hear me speak, but particular pleasure to see some former students, former research assistant, a number of friends, the Dominican sisters, an unexpected delight to reconnect with you all. And to say, great looking forward to speaking and to the seminar tomorrow. You may not recognize me from the portrait of me on the First Things website. Rumors that I'm related to Ratty from Wind in the Willows have been greatly exaggerated. Anyway, I want to speak this evening about the hour for a new humanism. We do live at a time when the most pressing question we face, I would suggest, is that of the ancient psalmist. What is man? Strange to tell, the most recent sign of this is that the question of God has re-emerged among intellectual and cultural leaders. For example, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Niall Ferguson, Paul Kingsnorth, and Russell Brand have all professed faith. Originally, when I wrote that sentence, I simply said intellectual leaders. Then I realized we're going to refer to Russell Brand, so I had to modify it slightly. Tom Holland and Elon Musk have commented on the importance of Christianity for culture. And most surprisingly, Richard Dawkins has claimed, albeit briefly as far as I could see, the mantle of a cultural Christian, though he has subsequently reassured the world that reports of his spiritual evolution have been greatly exaggerated. Only time will tell if this is significant. It's one of the tasks of a historian, particularly at parties, where somebody makes some statement about, we live in unprecedented times, or this has never happened before. The task of the historian is always to say, well, actually, in Florence in 1325, exactly the same thing happened. Well, in America in 1950, a very similar thing was happening. A number of intellectuals were professing significant interest in belief in God, and particularly in Christianity, such that the Partisan Review ran a series of articles by leading cultural figures entitled Religion and the Intellectuals. The authors they called on included Hannah Arendt, W.H. Auden, John Dewey, Robert Graves, A.J. Ayer, and Sidney Hook. And I want to quote you from the editor's introduction to the series, because I think it could well capture some of the, perhaps, excitement of our present moment. This is what the editor said. One of the most significant tendencies of our time, especially in this decade, has been the new turn toward religion among intellectuals and the growing disfavor with which secular attitudes and perspectives are now regarded in not a few circles that lay claim to the leadership of culture. There is no doubt that the number of intellectuals professing religious sympathies, beliefs, or doctrines is greater now than it was 10 or 20 years ago, and that this number is continually increasing or becoming more articulate. If we seek to relate our period to the recent past, the first decades of this century begin to look like decades of triumphant naturalism. And if the present tendency continues, the mid-century years may go down in history as the years of conversion and return. I know some people at the back, if you feel free to make it. It's Caleb. Feel free to come forward, Caleb and Claire. And I've just publicly embarrassed you in front of everybody. But the editor's claim now looks forlorn. As significant as that revival of elite sympathy for religion might then have seemed, it did not initiate a long-term change in the overall direction of the West or of the cultural fortunes of Christianity. Now, it's too early to know, I think, whether today's revival in intellectual religiosity will prove more than a fad. But I would suggest that, like its earlier analogue, it does indicate something about our contemporary context, because it has occurred during what might be described as a crisis in anthropology. As in the aftermath of World War II, what it means to be human has today become highly contested. Those who see this are striving to find some stable foundation upon which to build an answer, and they are seeking it in religion. This turn to theological matters is, if you like, one response to an anthropological problem. That was also the case in 1950 with the world that was emerging from the slaughter of war, facing the realities of the Holocaust and the inexorable spread of communism. Technology, too, posed new challenges. As Jean-Paul Sartre commented, the advent of atomic weapons placed human beings in an historically unique situation. For the first time in history, humanity had to decide to continue to exist. Today, the question of what it means to be human is, if anything, I would suggest, more vexed. Yet I also want to suggest that despite all the chaos, the shift in the rhetoric surrounding religion offers a glimpse of cultural and political hope. To adapt, that's not my good side, by the way, but actually I don't have a good side, so I shouldn't say that. To adapt a phrase from Nietzsche, the problem in our modern world is that man is dead and we have killed him. The concept of human nature is no longer subject to any kind of consensus, with obvious and catastrophic implications for society. Man has been abolished. So what has led to this abolition, the fruits of which many among the intelligentsia now see as problematic? 4 specific things suggest themselves. And here, some of you may have been at the Leonine Forum talk I gave before Christmas. I'm going to riff a little on that. I'm moving into Protestant preacher mode at this point, and I'm going to alliterate to make things more memorable. 4 specific things suggest themselves. Human nature has been dismantled. It has been disenchanted. It has been disembodied. And it has been desecrated. Dismantled, disenchanted, disembodied, desecrated. Dismantling has various causes. The Christianity which shaped Western society's anthropology was teleological, exemplified in the thought of Thomas Aquinas, Catholic theologian, but summarized, I think, most brilliantly by a Presbyterian in the first question and answer of the Westminster Shorter Catechism. What is the chief end of man? Man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. Humanity was defined by a purpose that transcended the desires of any individual. Man had ends that defined him, some natural, some supernatural. But teleology has been at a premium in Western thinking for generations. As science abandoned all causes but the efficient, understandings of the significance of the world and therefore of human nature were transformed. The most obvious examples of this are theories of evolution that eschew final causality, as they've shaped the modern cultural mindset. So they've dismantled the notion of human exceptionalism. When man has no God-given end at all, chief or otherwise, he really has no stable or distinct nature. In killing God, we also kill man. That point, I think, was well understood by Friedrich Nietzsche in his critique of Kant. One could not murder God and then smuggle human nature back into the metaphysical picture to do the deceased God's work for him. If God had died, so had the notion that human beings are made in his image. Nietzsche, of course, was a marginal figure in his own day. To the best of my knowledge, I think one lecture in the whole of Europe was given on Nietzsche's thought prior to his descent into madness in 1889. But his program was picked up in the latter part of the 20th century with some vigor by the French figure Michel Foucault. Foucault dismantled the notion of human beings as self-constituting rational agents. Instead, he saw them as the hapless products of networks of discursive power relations, a view that now rings out from countless university seminar rooms and underpins the rhetoric of identity politics, left and right. It's some years since I've checked, but last time I looked, I think in the humanities, Foucault was still the most cited figure in United States of America. The irony here is that it's man's own exceptional brilliance, his intellectual curiosity, his analytical abilities, his technological achievements that has enabled him to assert his utterly unexceptional, meaningless status. And while confusion over the question, what is a woman, has seized the headlines in recent years, I would submit that that is the result of a deeper confusion over the question of what it means to be human. The answer seems to be, we don't know if it means anything at all. Disenchantment. The disenchantment of human nature has many causes and takes many forms. Georg Lukács's concept of reification points to some of these. The industrialized society and the bureaucratized state tilt strongly towards treating people as just one more commodity, interchangeable with each other, easily replaceable, and therefore lacking intrinsic value as individual persons. Industrialization detaches labor from immediate community significance and recompenses it with money, thus altering its personal significance. I was talking just yesterday in class about Karl Marx and making one of the points that I think it's a helpful point in some ways that Marx makes, that we are constituted by how we make things. The potter who digs his own clay, bakes his own pot, makes his own glazes, bakes the glaze, and then goes to the market and exchanges that pot, takes pride in his work. My second long vacation from university. By the way, my PhD isn't from the University of Cambridge, just in case Cambridge complain. It's from the University of Aberdeen. I'm an undergraduate from Cambridge. I'm an MA. If you don't know the rules at Cambridge, you graduate with the BA, and if you haven't gone to prison within 10 terms and you pay the university £15, they turn it into an MA for you. So I'm actually an MA. When I told Grove that, because they were slightly confused at the fact that my MA came after my PhD, the provost assistant said she was very relieved to know that I had never been to prison. I pointed out to her that she only knew I'd never been to prison between 1988 and 1992. There is a long blank patch between there. But think about that potter. During my second long vacation from university, I worked in a factory where my job was to wheel pallets full of boxes containing the metal bits out of the middle of ring binders from one end of a factory to another. I have never looked at a ring binder and taken any pride in the fact that maybe I was involved in the construction of that. Industrial labor does change our relation to how we think about the things we make. But placing the blame for disenchantment exclusively on industrial capitalism would be to probe no deeper than a tendentious form of Marxism. The ideologies of the left have also played their role in disenchantment. The sexual revolution, that progressive watershed that promised liberation, has arguably done more than anything to turn people, especially women, into things, exchangeable commodities. Pornography, the most consistent iteration of the logic of the revolution, makes sex into a commodity and turns the actors on screen into objects for consumers with whom they have no personal relationship whatsoever. Fundamentally disenchanting, dehumanizing. Then there is the transformation of abortion from an unqualified evil, first into a necessary but regrettable necessity, and then into a reproductive right to be celebrated. This speaks both to how society's moral imagination has been shaped by the logic of the sexual revolution, where children are deemed accidental to sex, and how the humanity of the child in the womb has been stripped of any mysterious personhood it may once have had. The same can be said of reproductive technologies, such as IVF and surrogacy. While these latter phenomena witness to the good, indeed very human desire to have children, they also press the law and the cultural imagination towards treating children as things, as consumer items made to order, not begotten in mystery. And motherhood, too, is transformed with egg donation and surrogacy, turning women into service providers or reproductive machines. Recent reports that the UK, indeed, I think it's my own alma mater, the University of Cambridge, is on the verge of being able to manufacture sperms and eggs in the laboratory. These are but a harbinger of what is to come. Don't know if any of you saw that tweet today from the American scientist complaining that ethics is getting in the way of scientific progress. Fascinating. My own response to that would be, if only that was the case. Gene editing, embryo screening, commercialization of the fertility industry, all significant forces for the disenchantment and commodification of human life. The third element of our culture of dehumanization is that of disembodiment. There are multiple dimensions to this. Radical feminism, since Simone de Beauvoir, has tended to treat women's bodies and their distinct bodily functions, specifically those connected to childbearing, as problems that must be overcome if sexual equality is to be achieved. It's an interesting interview available online, a Marxist magazine from the 1970s, where de Beauvoir makes the point that it doesn't matter what you do to make women equal with men, you could make them General Secretary of the Communist Party, she says. It will make no difference until motherhood has been destroyed. And the interview is in the context of talking about the role of technology in the political struggle. De Beauvoir's struggle has been reinforced by technologies that allow natural bodily ends to be subverted and therefore to look like bugs rather than features of the human body. The body, the natural body, becomes a hindrance to the liberation of some mysterious self that dwells within the body. This tilt to disembodiment is not restricted to sexual matters. The more our human interactions are mediated via handheld technology, whether Uber apps or social media sites, the less important is bodily interaction. Never in human history has life required less actual physical interpersonal engagement than today. The rising importance of chatbots, artificial intelligence and robotics will only compound this in years to come. I can now order a meal, ride in a taxi, even have a romantic conversation without ever having to engage another real person. The apparent convenience of this can hide the fact that it comes with a cost. Our embodiment is important to how we interact with each other. Very struck by this incident from the life of George Orwell. George Orwell once wrote a very angry letter to his publisher, who was going to publish some works by Stephen Spender, the great English poet. Spender at the time was homosexual. Orwell objected strongly to that, and he lambasted his publisher for having any connections with such a man. 6 months later, Orwell writes to Spender to apologize. And Spender asked Orwell what had led to this change of heart. What had led to this change of heart was Orwell had actually met Stephen Spender in the interim. And Orwell's response to Spender includes the following. Here I quote, "Even if when I met you, I had not happened to like you, I should have been bound to change my attitude. Because when you meet anyone in the flesh, you realize immediately that he is a human being and not a sort of caricature embodying certain ideas." What Orwell is saying is this: meeting Spender in real life humanized Spender to him. He became a person and not simply an idea. We might also add that it humanized Orwell. I'm not going to talk about this tonight, actually, but I do think that the online prosecution, particularly of political discussions, is one of the most dehumanizing things that is occurring today. I don't do online stuff, but occasionally my son sends me amusing criticisms that have been made about me online, on Twitter or somewhere. Occasionally I meet the people who've made these criticisms. I've always found them to be the most obsequious and unctuous people I've ever come across. They never have the courage to say to my face what they bravely say about me online. And I believe that is a not unique experience to myself. It is bodily interaction that is key here. Looking into the eyes of another involves a degree of personal communion. It reveals the other person as a human being, such as we are ourselves. To use biblical language, bone of our bone and flesh of our flesh. Today, social media has universalized the experience of disembodied social interaction and even perhaps made such normative for interpersonal engagement. Ironically, this often reduces the disembodied interlocutors to the sum total of the opinions they express and thereby turns them from real persons into aggregates of ideological fragments. No wonder social media can prove such a cesspool. Like calling pornography adult entertainment when it is anything but adult. Calling social media social is interesting when it is anything, it seems to me, but social by and large. This tilt to disembodiment is not restricted to social media. Part of what makes, by the way, there is some good news coming. I said at the start, the signs of hope. If you're feeling hopeless at this point, hang in for another 10 minutes. We will get there. Part of what makes surrogacy plausible is the assumption that the experience of pregnancy in itself is of comparatively little importance to the relationship of mother and child, that the maternal bond is really something that occurs postpartum. One might object that adoption assumes the same, but the cases are not parallel. Adoption involves a couple taking the place of biological parents who should be there but for some reason are not. It does not present itself as a normative model for parenting, but as compensation for an unavoidable privation. Surrogacy introduces a third party and carries with it, I think, a new normative model of what a parent is, one where gestation is accidental. It also reinforces the transformation of the body into a commodity, a thing. Building on the work of the Heritage Foundation's Emma Waters, Brad Littlejohn and Claire Morrell, both of whom are present this evening, describe surrogacy's effects as follows. Surrogacy agreements separate biological motherhood from the intimate experience of pregnancy, labor, and delivery, and represent a commodification of the female body. End quote. And as Littlejohn and Morrell conclude, the risk is ultimately not restricted to women. What is transformed through the normalization of such procedures is society's view of humanity, turning it into a product that is fabricated. The transgender issue is also pertinent. See, I'm avoiding all the controversial stuff this evening. The transgender issue is also pertinent, given that it involves both a psychologized view of identity and that marginalizes the sex nature of the body, and the belief that bodies are simply raw material. Such ideas are plausible partly because the way in which society's broader intuitions about embodiment have been shaped by technology and its impact on human interactions over recent decades. And then, once again, there is pornography. We noted above its role in disenchanting human nature. It also serves to disembody it, perhaps a counterintuitive claim given the central role of bodies in its products. But pornography detaches sex from any real relationship, indeed from any need for physical contact with or commitment to another. Consumers enjoy that quintessentially embodied form of human behavior in a fundamentally disembodied way, and in a manner that detaches them from any of the concomitants that real-life bodily interactions leading to sex typically require, from personal hygiene to the effort involved in a romantic relationship, not to mention a successful marriage. Pornography also points to the fourth facet of the modern assault on human nature. Human nature has been desecrated. Sex has typically been regarded as having sacred connotations. The Torah deals with sexual matters in terms of cleanness and uncleanness. The Quran prescribes special post-coital washings. Paul in the New Testament sees the sexual use of the body as a matter of great importance, such that a man's use of a prostitute is regarded as especially heinous and is involving a fundamental disruption of his own humanity and his relationship to the church. To consider sex as sacred makes perfect sense, for it is the act that makes human beings most like God, that which creates new life. The sexual revolution, though, did not simply make sex into recreation. It thereby stripped it, and therefore the human nature, of which it is a central part, of its sacred nature. The concept of desecration also helps to explain the delight taken in the dismantling, disenchanting, and disembodiment of human nature, which those categories in themselves cannot explain. Been fascinated by the rhetorical move on the abortion issue between the 1990s and today. In the 1990s, the pitch was, abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. That is to hold a disenchanted view of human nature, I think. But to glory in it as a so-called reproductive right and to take pride in shouting about it points to an exhilaration that only transgression can deliver. I'm reminded, as I read that paragraph, of that passage in Dostoevsky's Notes from the House of the Dead, when he's giving those little pen portraits of the various criminals that he is incarcerated with. And one of them is an aristocratic gentleman. And Dostoevsky learns that this gentleman is the equivalent of what we would call today a serial killer. He's a wealthy man, he comes from a very good background, but he's killed numerous people. And Dostoevsky wonders why. What drives a man who's the man who has everything to commit such heinous crimes? And his comment is, it's as if, having once jumped over the boundary that was sacred, nothing is sacred to him anymore. And Dostoevsky, I think, gets to the exhilaration that transgression brings in its wake. Current pro-abortion politics are the politics of transgression, specifically the transgression of that once considered to be sacred. The same, interesting enough, applies to death. As with sex and the creation of life, so cultures have typically surrounded the end of life with sacred significance. The Torah's approach to sex and cleanness has parallels in its regulation regarding the treatment of dead bodies. And even in our secularized culture today, there are laws against the abuse of corpses that often use the language of desecration. To desecrate a corpse is a serious crime. That, I think, is a significant linguistic tick. And yet, Western societies are making great efforts to transform death from a mystery to a medical procedure, and even into a routine response not simply to late-stage terminal illness, but to old age in general, depression, and increasingly any condition that can be presented as burdensome to the individual, to the family, or even to the state. I wrote a little piece for First Things last week on assisted death in Canada. And I had an email today from a lady, I can't verify it, of course, but a lady from Canada emailed me today to say that increasing pressure is being put on Canadians who give birth to children with birth defects to have the children euthanized at birth because they will be a burden on the state. I can't verify that, but it strikes me as horribly plausible, coming from a country where a few years ago, nearly 1 in 20 deaths were by medically assisted dying. So human nature has been demolished, disenchanted, disembodied, and desecrated. I've run out of time, so I'm going to have to leave you with the bad news. No, let's move to the more positive stuff. The results are all around and are the cause of much of the moral chaos that characterizes contemporary Western societies. The psalmist's question, "What is man?" was originally meant to express wonder at his undeserved status before God. Psalm 8, if you want to look it up when you go home tonight. But in our mouths, it has become a rhetorical expression of our nothingness. This brings us to the point of hopeful continuity between those committed to Orthodox Christianity and those who now use the language of cultural Christianity. And that is a shared desire to build a response to our current chaos on some kind of stable anthropology, a retrieval of what it means to be human. Only such a renewed humanism, I think, can address the current crisis of anthropology. Now, the question of how this can be done is problematic because of at least 2 challenges. And here I note these 2 challenges, not to resolve them, but merely to highlight them as issues for further discussion. First, there is the fact that whatever its theoretical origins in 19th and 20th century thought, the abolition of man has been practically accomplished via technological developments upon which we all now depend. Indeed, the very concept of human nature is now plausibly negotiable because it seems inseparable from and largely subject to the technology by which we relate to the world and to each other. About 18 months ago, I was interviewed by a former journalist, I think at the St. Louis Dispatch, very progressive, just very delightful lady. It was a strange story. I was introduced to her by Muslim friends, a very strange way that I was connected to her. And we spent about an hour talking online about the transgender issue. And she asked me, how would you define a woman? And I gave Abigail Favale's definition that a woman is a human being whose body is normatively tailored towards gestation. And she responded, so would it make a difference? I was using a teleological argument. She said, would it make a difference if technology could overcome the teleological limitations of the male body? Womb transplants, that kind of thing. And I had to confess that I did not have an immediate answer off the top of my head. I'll probably give a better one now. But that shows how technology really does inject complexity into these discussions. And this is complicated by the fact that I don't think we can simply withdraw from a technological context. I think it's okay for Wendell Berry to exalt agrarianism, but I don't think Wendell Berry can exist outside of an industrial society, actually, myself. I think there are things that he depends upon. Modern-day anchorites might call us to do so, to withdraw, but it's worth remembering that Simon Stylites could only stand at the top of his pole because other lesser mortals grew the grain, ground the corn, and baked the bread that kept him alive. I didn't do my PhD at Cambridge, but as an undergraduate at Cambridge, my history supervisor was a card-carrying Marxist. And he taught me the one thing you always have to ask is, who pays for this? Anything that happens in history, who's footing the bill? Somebody footed the bill for Simon Stylites, and it wasn't Simon Stylites. We have to find ways to recover human nature that do not present an unrealistic romanticism as a normative possibility for the majority of people. Second, there is the theological problem that a lack of social consensus on the existence of God, let alone specific religious dogma and practice, precludes consensus on any view of human nature grounded in the divine image. This latter point is very significant, I think, given that the response to the desecration of human nature ultimately has to be its consecration, something that can only occur within a sacred religious context. And if Christianity ultimately sees desecration as the root of all of man's problems, then our religious context today means we must necessarily be modest about what we can achieve without such a sacred context. So those are the two problems: technology and no religious consensus. But that's the real world. We have to operate within that world that we are given and not the one that we would choose for ourselves. Resisting the temptation to quote Gandalf there, because everybody quotes Gandalf there. Nonetheless, I think some progress can be made on the first three aspects of the anthropological crisis: dismantling, disenchantment, disembodiment. The Christian distinction between natural and supernatural ends would seem to be helpful here. The two cannot be absolutely separated in Christian theology, I do not think, but there is much evidence to suggest that there can be an intuitive consensus on at least some natural ends between the religious and the non-religious. The current revival of interest in religion among intellectuals, even if, as in the case of Dawkins, it is pragmatic rather than dogmatic, witnesses to a shared intuition that our cultural problems are founded in a deeper anthropological confusion. And that should encourage us. It may not be a return to Christian civilization, if ever there truly was such a thing, but it may well mark the advent of an era in which discussion of a new humanism can be profitably pursued by both the religious and the non-religious. It is no surprise to Christians that attempts to deny human nature end up either in confusion or subject to a dialectical transformation into the opposite of what was intended. Those confusions and transformations are visible to many secular thinkers too. Therefore, pointing out the failure of secular policies to deliver on their promises is useful both in building a humanist alliance and in pressing anti-humanists onto the defensive. Such imminent critique is a way of making space for genuine dialogue and constructive policy formulation. Trans ideology is a good example. There is an obvious contradiction at the heart of its philosophy of selfhood. It authorizes disembodiment in its denial of the role of the individual's sex physiology for identity as man or woman. Yet it also insists upon the transformation of the body if the individual is to be authentically who they really are. The body is simultaneously of no importance and yet of overwhelming importance. Further, allowing inner psychological states to determine identity tilts into obvious incoherence if biology is disregarded. Ask yourself why a man cannot be a wolf if he's convinced that he's a wolf. Well, one characteristic I would suggest of being a wolf is a complete lack of self-consciousness of one's wolf essence. So to identify as a wolf is patently ridiculous. The trans issue also plays into a strange contradiction within the culture of death. I noted above the transformation of death from a sacred mystery into a medical procedure. Yet there are at least 2 cases in Canada, and I'm grateful to Jacob, former student of mine who's here this evening, for putting me onto this, and I chased it up just a few weeks ago. There are at least 2 cases in Canada where seriously depressed individuals have been refused medically assisted deaths, even though they met the standard criteria. Why? Well, coincidentally, in inverted commas, both involve people who have undergone gender transition surgery. The surgery did not work and left these individuals in both physical and mental pain. But their requests for death were refused. I'm speculating here, but it is hard not to interpret this as the result of a contradiction generated by progressivism's commitment both to trans ideology and the culture of assisted suicide. To grant death would be to acknowledge that gender transition is not the answer to gender dysphoria. In our progressive version of Animal Farm, all causes of suffering are equal, but some are perhaps more equal than others. Men competing in sport. Just for the record, I consider the debate about women in sport to be the most trivial aspect of the whole trans issue compared to women's private spaces and safety. And yet, it's this issue that has gripped the public imagination. Its focus on fairness sidesteps the issue that makes trans ideology so plausible to so many. Its foundation in those dominant tastes of our day, psychologized selfhood and personal happiness. In so doing, the debate about women's sports offers the opportunity for highlighting the importance of embodiment. Which is going to be more plausible? The rebarbative prose of a Judith Butler or a Gail Rubin? I don't recommend you read them. By the way, it would be 15 minutes of your life you will never get back. Or the specious libertarianism of the ACLU? Or the picture of Riley Gaines standing next to a man posing as a woman on a podium? The case for a new humanism is there made incarnate. The transgender issue also connects to the matter of IVF. The president's actions regarding transgenderism, from my perspective, are most welcome. But those on IVF suggest that these policies are driven more by taste than a coherent anthropology. The tech bros influencing the president rightly abhor the genital and hormonal mutilation of children. But they are clearly not wrestling with the broader question of which transgenderism is a function. What status should we grant biological limitations in an era of Promethean technology? Yet as disappointing as the inconsistency is, it offers a chance for serious discussion about why these policy decisions are inconsistent. The sexual revolution is also ripe for imminent critique. Its intention was to liberate by allowing for true sexual agency, but it has ended up turning everyone into objects. Easy access to the pill was sold as good news for women, but men were the real beneficiaries. Who could have seen that coming? Stunning, really, of the commitment-free promiscuity it enabled. And despite the claims of some feminists, pornography is bad news for women too, with its links to human trafficking and its transformation of the sexual expectations men have of their partners. Much of this has recently been pointed out in pungent detail by writers Mary Harrington and Louise Perry, using secular arguments and evidence. Their work protests both the disembodiment of human nature and its disenchantment, seeing in the sexual revolution a prime example of promises betrayed and humans dehumanized. And again, in doing so, they point to the possibility of constructive conversations with the non-religious concerning human nature, and thus the possibility of a new humanism. There are other examples to which I could point, such as Jonathan Haidt's arguments concerning the effects of social media on young people. Again, his is not a religious argument, but one that understands human nature as not being infinitely pliable. There is the work of an avowedly secular thinker, such as David Balinsky. There is emerging support across traditional political divides for anti-pornography initiatives. Many parents are becoming more skeptical of the role of screens and smartphones in the lives of children. Combine all this with the renewed interest among intellectuals in Christianity and its cultural influence, and the moment could be here for a new humanism. And we don't need to wait for agreement on religious premises to start these discussions. We need only point to the internal contradictions and the catastrophic consequences of our modern anti-humanist ways. None of this is to say that a new humanism, uniting both religious and non-religious relative to human nature and its natural ends, will necessarily emerge in this earthly city. We may not win the day, and I don't usually quote King Ahab positively in lectures, but I'm going to quote him now. To quote Ahab, one who puts on his armor should not boast as one who takes it off. Anti-humanist rhetoric and thought grips the imagination of the Jacobins on the left and the right. But there are signs that the anti-humanism of our age is overreaching, pressing the dismantling, disenchanting, and disembodiment of human nature to untenable extremes. Many are coming to the realization that we can only fight human nature for so long with impunity. It remains to be seen whether that means we will self-destruct or whether a new consensus on what it means to be human will emerge to shape our political discourse, our social policies, and our communities. So historians, students are always asking me, are we doomed? Is society going to self-destruct? I would say, well, societies have self-destructed in the past, and the follow-up question is, so how do you tell the difference between a society that pulls back from the brink or a society that self-destructs? The answer is, it does one or the other. You can't tell until it's actually happened. So we could self-destruct. I'm English. I'm American, but culturally English, of course. So my money's on self-destruction, actually. But I hope that I will be wrong on that. The struggle for our cultural and political future is not best understood as between right, left, conservative, and progressive, I think, but as between humanists and anti-humanists. And given the lateness of the day, I submit that the hour for advocating a new humanism is now upon us. Thank you for listening so patiently.
I will field some questions. Does the mic work? Okay. Oh, no, my mic works now. So I'll field the questions, and we'll follow some ground rules, which is that when you ask a question, it should be a question. Exactly. So perorations can be saved for later so we can deal with questions. So the floor is open, and I'm happy to take a question. Yes, please.
Brilliant. So do you really doubt that Christian civilization existed in the Middle Ages?
I'm not sure it's... it depends on how you define it. I look back on the Middle Ages, and the Middle Ages weren't that great for an awful lot of people. I would not want to have been my ancestors in the 13th, 14th century. It would have been a miserable existence in a lot of ways. The medieval times may have been great for the knights of the manor, for the monarchs, but not for the peasants. So I have that sort of hesitation. I have the hesitation of, for all that I've railed somewhat against technology, I do not want to go back to a society without antibiotics and analgesics and those kind of things. If you want to use Christian civilization in the narrow sense that it was Christianity that sort of set the moral agenda for law codes and things, then yes, absolutely agree with that. I sometimes think, though, that the language of Christian civilization is used in a somewhat nostalgic way to mean more than that. But yeah, no problem at all in saying Christian civilization as a moral order built on a sacred order.
Other questions? Yes, please.
Does the debate over vaccines fit anywhere within your framework? How do you think about that?
To be honest, I don't think about that. I think I'm vaccinated against everything possible going, so I have no idea. I have no understanding of the science. I tend to trust the medical establishment by and large, but I don't see that it necessarily connects to this. Where I would say, in general, the issue on the broader medical question, I think comes down to, does medical treatment restore what it means to be human or transcend what it means to be human? And I'm not sure if that connects to the vaccine, but I would say, if technology allows us to give a man with one leg 2 legs, that's a legitimate use of technology, medical technology. If we want to use medical technology to give a man with 2 legs 3 legs, that's involving a fundamental transformation of what is normatively understood to be a human being. And that would be one of my big concerns about the tech bros. I think the tech bros are eugenicists. I think that's where it's going. I think it's a eugenics thing. And that, I'm much more worried about that than I am about debates about vaccines.
It's a kind of eugenicism under the sign of choice.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that the danger we face is that with IVF, because it allows eugenic practices with embryo selection, which is already happening,
Yeah.
that it could be in 20 years' time, if the technology becomes cheap enough, you won't be prohibited from having children in the natural way, but it'll be like smoking.
Yeah.
You're allowed to do it, but you're strongly discouraged because it's irresponsible to have children in that way. I can
This is
easily
insurance
imagine that.
premiums.
But I can easily imagine that kind of rhetoric.
Oh, yeah. Sophie
becoming-
Lewis is already pushing for that as a feminist, her full surrogacy now, for slightly different reasons. But the pressure on natural parenthood is growing from a number of different directions.
Yes.
For your talk. What is the place of evangelization in this new humanism, according to you?
So it's good for me to see who asked the question, I think evangelization is the task of the church. So my lecture tonight, I'm really thinking, what do we do in the public square? How do we operate in the public square to get people thinking in the right way about what it means to be human? Clearly, the ultimate answer to our problems, I would say, is everybody becomes a Christian. Everybody agrees on the biblical teaching about what it means to be a human being. I work on the basis that that isn't going to happen anytime soon, if ever. And so I want to operate at a more pragmatic level. I can do business with somebody who agrees with me on euthanasia, even if they disagree with me on the foundations as to why they hold the same position as me. But in terms of evangelization, that's not the task of the government, that's the task of the church. And certainly that is to go hand in hand with what's going on, but it's the task of the church, not the government.
Assuming that is a task of the government at all, I was asking, what do you think, or how much evangelization will play an essential role or not in this new humanism, regardless of who is doing it?
I think it would be, Well, if I was to go, if I was to dig deeper into what I'm saying, how are we going to, you can't legislate a new humanism. I think it has to be engaged at a more local level. How do I persuade my neighbor? How do I persuade my local school board? How do I persuade the people I engage with in the classroom to hold a correct position? I think evangelization plays a role there. Does that answer? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And I suffer from recency bias, so I heard a term that I thought of when you were talking, and I'm going to butcher pronouncing it, but it was immanentizing the eschaton. So, when you think about building this humanism, that really talks about a utopian, right? Whether it's the eugenics of the tech bros and everything else. Do you think that getting on the same page about that's not a possibility is a fundamental beginning to that? And can you go anywhere if you don't have that agreement that we can't do that? We can't create utopia.
Yeah, I think utopianism, the history of utopianism is not a good one. Not a good one at all. And that's why I think it's very important, particularly for Christians as well, to have a modest and limited understanding of what can be done. I shudder at some of the things that the Christian nationalists are saying. Or not the New York Times Christian nationalists, I mean the real Christian nationalists. I suspect that in 20 years' time they will just be nationalists because Christianity will not deliver for them that for which they are looking, a kind of ethnic utopia of some kind. So my approach, I'm more of an Augustinian. I'm thinking, this earthly city, it's always going to be fallen. There are always going to be limits. It's always going to be a question of mitigating the damage rather than immanentizing the eschaton, realizing the kingdom of heaven on earth. And I'm very comfortable with that. I think it's realistic. A lot of people have accused me of being a defeatist on that one. I'm not a defeatist. I think it's a realistic approach. If you think you're taking over Congress for Jesus this time next week, you're going to be tragically disappointed. I think we need a modest approach, and we need to work with what is possible. I mean, if God sends a huge revival, great, things could change by this time next week. But I work on the assumption that isn't going to happen. We have to work with the world as we find it, and we have to build alliances with people who share our commitments on things. I spoke just 18 months ago to a Muslim gathering in, of all places, Berkeley, California. It was great fun. I was across the road from UC Berkeley, the center, Judith Butler's powerhouse. There I am across the road speaking to a gathering of Muslims on the transgender issue. Very comfortable doing that. Incidentally, it was one of the places I spoke at the sort of the heat woke time where they had no security to protect me. Isn't that interesting? I can speak to a group of Muslims and there's nobody's messing with me while I'm there. So I was very grateful for that. But I'm happy to stand shoulder to shoulder on any given issue with anybody who will stand shoulder to shoulder with me on that issue.
Yes, Jason.
I had a question regarding technology, the challenge. And I'm wondering, to what extent you think that it is something that is an exogenous process or something that is endogenous to the society. You that the Simone de Beauvoir quote, and in that case, you would think that technology is developing because of her anthropology or in response to it. In other cases, it seems though you think that technology is just this organic, outside force that is going to progress whether we like it or not. And to what extent is technology, again, determined by the way that we think of ourselves and our humanity?
Yeah, that's in some ways, that's a version of the is it ideas or material conditions that drive history. It's, I hate to sound very English again, but I think it's both. I think technology makes certain ideas plausible. Ideas lead to the asking of certain questions that can lead to the development of certain technologies. So I think it's a mixture of the two. What I think is important is to realize that the interests of the tech bros and the interests of humanity in general are not the same thing. And again, it was actually that at the Muslim gathering that I spoke at, the ulema who'd invited me to speak had been in Rome, I think a month before, for the Pope had convened a gathering of religious leaders and tech leaders on artificial intelligence. And I asked him, I said, what was the most interesting thing in the gathering? He said, the most interesting thing in the gathering was this. On the day one, the tech leaders made all their presentations. On day two, the religious leaders made all their presentations, he said. By day two, all the tech guys had gone. They made their presentations and left. They were not interested. So I think it's a mixture of both. I think the important question to ask, though, is, it's like my old Marxist supervisor's question, who does well out of this? Who does well out of this being presented as natural and normal? And that's where I worry about. People are worried that Elon Musk is killing democracy. I'm not worried about that. I'm actually worried that he's killing the stick shift. I think if you don't drive a stick shift car, you don't really drive. I've distrusted him for years because of this destroying the stick shift thing. But I'm less concerned about the threat to democracy and more concerned about the threat to human nature that technology presents.
Yes, we have one. Brad?
A minute ago, in response to another question, you talked about this as a problem of evangelization, and then in an ideal world, if we could evangelize our way out of this. But it seems to me that these issues are as much an issue within the church as without.
Yeah.
There's an issue of a failure of catechesis.
Yeah.
Why do you think the church has been so bad at catechizing its people on what it means to be human?
Yeah.
And what can it do to improve?
Yeah, good question. I think COVID revealed a lot of the weakness on this front. I can't speak for Catholicism or Orthodoxy. What shocked me in Protestantism was how easily Protestant churches went online. Now, I'm not saying that going online wasn't a prudent thing to do when everything first exploded. You don't want to come to church and have 60% of your congregation die in 10 days. But the fact that people didn't think anything had really been lost, and many have continued to worship online in the years since, told me that a lot of Protestants never got the importance of actually being in worship as embodied human beings. And I think that speaks to one aspect of what you've raised, Brad, that it proves that, we've done a bad job. Why have we done a bad job? There could be a number of reasons. One, I think, is certainly in the United States, the broad Christian nature, in a very attenuated sense, of the culture meant that a lot of the big questions were never raised, particularly in Protestantism, in the ethical realm. We never raised the big ethical questions because they were never questions. The broader culture tracked with Protestantism on so many moral issues, and we just got lazy. We never thought we'd have to ask those questions. It's why so many of us are very grateful to read Roman Catholic authors now, because Catholicism was asking these questions when Protestantism wasn't. I think also in America there is a deeply ingrained confidence in technology. It staggers me. It's very interesting coming from England to America, where, I don't mean this in a patronizing way, but America really has no history. It doesn't go back very far. That America's identity always seems to me to have lain in the future somehow. The reason I'm a pessimistic Englishman is that English identity lies in the past, which was glorious and no longer is. So I tilt towards being pessimistic. And so I think you also in America have to overcome a natural tilt towards the idea that progress, particularly technological progress, is a good thing. That's deeply ingrained in the culture. I think there's also the notion of freedom as a positive thing. And you've written, of course, on this wonderfully. That's difficult. When I teach my humanities course at Grove, I start by quoting Jean-Paul Sartre. Man is condemned to be free. And I say, none of you understand this. You're all Americans. None of you understand this, because freedom is what you live for. Well, I say, now I'm going to tell you. I'm going to make you understand this. You have to invent the question that you answer your paper on in my class. I'm not going to give you a question. You have to think one up for yourself. It's amazing how many of them beg me to think of a question. I say, no, 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 you're free. You're free. You're condemned to be free at this point. I think the idea of individual freedom is very deep and connected to some of these problems. I disagree with, I think, with some of his historical assumptions here, but again, very struck by the Catholic philosopher Augusto del Noce, who makes the comment that our colleague Fran Mayer is always quoting, that the sexual revolution, he's writing this in 1969, he says the sexual revolution will wreak more havoc in America than in any other Western nation, not despite, but because of its Puritan heritage. And that's always bugged me. And I really want to press back on that. But what he's getting at, I think, is that liberty of conscience that was so dear to the Pilgrim Fathers. Once conscience is detached from an agreed moral consensus on a moral shape for humanity, it becomes very destructive indeed. And that's what I think we're witnessing today. And that's why the tech bros are wreaking more havoc in America in some ways than they are in Western Europe.
Yes, in the front here.
Trent Gruber. I was curious what your definition of cultural Christianity is, and if you think that that's a more pragmatic approach for promoting this humanism as opposed to evangelizing, and also if the government has some sort of role in promoting cultural Christianity.
Good question. I think, cultural Christianity, I think the way somebody like Richard Dawkins is using it. How would I interpret Richard Dawkins? Clearly, he's not affirming belief in God, and he's gone out of his way to affirm that since he's been pulled up on this. I think what Richard Dawkins really wants is human nature. I think there's a sense in which if Nietzsche was here, he'd say to Richard Dawkins, you're doing precisely what I accused Kant of doing. Kant, this spider at the center of the metaphysical web, he's smuggling human nature back in to preserve those bits of Prussian culture that he likes and approves of that really had their origins in a belief in God. So I think cultural Christianity is code for an understanding of human nature as having some kind of moral shape. That's what I think Dawkins wants to do with it. Does the government have a role in that? I don't think you can legislate people into believing in human nature. But I do think you can pass legislation that nudges people in the right direction. It's interesting to me how, if you'd asked me 3 years ago, will the trans issue collapse? I'd have said yes, but not in my lifetime. 2 years ago, I'd have said yes, but it's going to take a decade. Now I'm thinking it could be done and dusted in 2 years, and I'm naturally a pessimist. How's that come about? Well, partly it's come about through a lot of grassroots activism. But what has really triggered the collapse has been Donald Trump's executive order. Now that we have Gavin Newsom changing his mind.
Yes.
Well, he's got daughters. What I want to say to Gavin Newsom, the science doesn't change because you have daughters, man. It was the same science 5 years ago, and you had daughters then. But I do think that is law downstream or upstream from culture? Again, I think it's a bit of both. I think laws can nudge people in the right direction. So I don't think we should neglect allying with whomever we have to ally with to nudge people in the right direction. And I know Claire, who's in the audience tonight, who's profiled in the New York Times, done great work on a bipartisan level in state legislatures, trying to get age verification laws passed on pornography so we can keep it away from children. Those kind of laws, I think, nudge society in the right direction.
Well, at the very least, also, there's harm reduction. At the very least, we could remove the capacity of pro-trans activists to draw upon the power of government to make dissent from their views legally problematic or subject to liability.
Another great example,
Yes, on the far corner there, yes. That gentleman right there.
I think you mentioned partnering with anyone that we can partner with. And you've also talked about how it's a personal, local and national struggle for the new humanism. My question is globally. So what are both the opportunities and the responsibilities of a new international humanism?
Yeah, that's at this point I'm classy. I'm just a Reformation historian by training, so I'm way out of my depth on a whole heap of this stuff. But I think there are good signs. Ironically, for some years, I've been very encouraged by European developments on the trans front. Oddly, Europe has been becoming much more conservative before the United States started. Mm-hmm. A good argument can be made, I think, for the way that pharmaceuticals is funded in Europe as compared to the United States. That did not make trans medicine such an incentivized thing. Canada funds pharmaceuticals in a very similar way to Europe, so Canada would have to be the exception to the rule if you accepted that as an interpretation. But I think there are clear signs across the globe that there are groups emerging where, disillusionment, particularly on the trans issue, is coming out. On other issues, I'm not so sanguine. I think on abortion, the sexual revolution has so gripped the imagination of so many people influenced by the West. That's problematic. That's going to take longer to get at. The problematic nature of that is less obvious, it seems to me. But again, the thing is, it'll be interesting. I've not dug into the details yet, but the pulling of US aid. How much of US aid has gone to promoting US progressivism around the world? Well, again, my Marxist supervisor, another one of his phrases, follow the money. When the money gets pulled, it's amazing how the science can change overnight in some areas. So I wonder if financial pressure is one way of addressing this as well. And I think it's, again, what does technology do that's good? I have friends, sort of, maybe friends is stretching it a bit, but I now have connections across the globe with people working in similar areas and facing similar questions. I think the chance for global networking, even at a grassroots level, is tremendous today. So I'm relatively optimistic on that front as well. I do fear that a reaction against left progressivism is a kind of right-wing anti-humanism, very disturbed by the emergence of anti-Semitism as a force on the right, even on the Christian right. There are anti-humanist tendencies at play. Last year I wrote a piece for First Things on, is it Christianity or Nietzscheanism? And the funny thing was, the Christian Nietzscheans all responded in a way saying, Trueman's a liar, da-dum-da-dum, in a way that totally proved my point. It's not very often that the refutations of your argument are actually further evidence that you're hitting the target. But I am concerned that we need to, again, going back to the very last thing I said, I don't think the struggle is between left and right so much now around the globe as it is between humanists and anti-humanists. Those who believe human nature is something, and those who believe, no, it isn't.
One final question. Yes, in the front.
You call for a new humanism, but the word humanist in many cases is used for atheists, like the American Humanist Association. How do we take back the term?
Yeah, I've hemmed and hawed about using the term humanist for precisely that reason. Of course, it's coined really originally to think about men of letters in the Reformation and the Renaissance. So it didn't have the anti-theistic connotations then. I mean, John Calvin was a humanist till the day he died. Martin Luther, I think, is the only leading reformer who's not a humanist. And there are great humanists on the Catholic side as well. So I think it is retrievable. I think when you use it, you have to clarify that point. You have to define it. But I think, maybe we could say people who believe there is such a thing as human nature. I'd rather say humanist because it takes up less breath and it's more concise. But maybe defining it carefully at the outset is the way to go. But obviously, in a one-to-one conversation, I'd want to be very careful. Where I'm coming from is, I remember being very intrigued by a statement that Charles Taylor makes in A Secular Age, where he says, the struggle in modernity is not a two-way fight between believers and unbelievers. In typical Taylor fashion, it's at least a three-way fight between Nietzschean anti-humanists, humanists, and believers. And he says, it depends what question you ask as to how the sides line up. If you ask about the existence of God, the Nietzscheans and the humanists line up against the believers. But he says, if you ask about, does human nature exist and have a moral structure, the believers and the humanists line up against the Nietzscheans. And so I'm trying to find a term that allows me to capture that. And it seems to me that humanism in an expanded definition is probably the best way of going about it. If you can think of a better term, I'm in. I'm not wedded to the term at all. I'm very happy to use another term if we can come up with a better one.
Well, please join me in thanking Carl again.
Thank you.